"Father, the roof is cracking again." The boy's voice carried across the small courtyard as dried mud flaked from the ceiling beams above the sleeping area. His father looked up from the grinding stone, wiping sweat from his brow in the afternoon heat. The smell of limestone dust mixed with cooking smoke hung in the air. Above them, the flat roof where the family slept in summer showed another fissure, thin as a thread but growing. For centuries, we have imagined the homes of Jesus' time as simple backdrops to the gospel stories, nothing more than stage settings for divine drama. But what if the very walls that surrounded Jesus, the roofs he climbed, and the floors he swept held lessons that shaped his teaching? What was it actually like to live inside these structures 2,000 years ago, when a house was not simply shelter, but a complex system of survival? How did families cook, sleep, store food, welcome guests, conduct business, pray, and raise children within spaces that modern people would find shockingly small and multi-purpose? We rarely pause to consider that Jesus spent entire decades within these architectural forms, that his hands knew the texture of mud brick walls, that his feet felt the difference between packed earth floors and stone thresholds, that his childhood games happened in courtyards, whose dimensions determined the rhythm of family life. For centuries, we have imagined houses in biblical times as quaint, rustic dwellings, charming in their simplicity. But the reality was far from romantic. These homes were sophisticated adaptations to a harsh environment where summer temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where winter rains could dissolve walls in days, where privacy was luxury and space was calculated in cubits, not rooms. The smell of animals mingled with bread baking in clay ovens. The sound of grinding stones began before dawn. The texture of rough plaster scraped against shoulders in narrow doorways. The taste of dust settled on every meal. These sensory details were not background noise. They were the substance of daily existence, the physical grammar through which spiritual truths would later be communicated. Understanding how a first-century Palestinian house actually functioned, how it was built, maintained, used, and experienced, reveals how Jesus connected ordinary domestic life to eternal kingdom principles. Many details of the Gospels gain new and deeper meaning when we reconstruct the architectural reality that surrounded their telling. Stay until the end, because what you are about to discover goes beyond historical curiosity and can strengthen our faith today. But this architectural reality began with the most fundamental element: the walls themselves. In Nazareth and surrounding Galilean villages, houses were not constructed from the dressed stone of Jerusalem's wealthy quarters, but from sun-dried mud bricks mixed with straw, each brick shaped by hand in wooden molds and left to harden under the relentless Middle Eastern sun. These bricks measured roughly 16 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches thick, though dimensions varied by the maker's hand and the mold available. The clay came from local deposits, often reddish-brown in color, mixed with chopped straw that prevented cracking as the brick dried. Workers trod the mixture with bare feet, feeling the transformation from separate elements into binding compound, the straw fibers distributing evenly through the clay matrix. The finished bricks felt rough and porous to the touch, lighter than fired pottery, but dense enough to provide thermal mass. When stacked, they required mud mortar between courses, the same clay mixture serving as both brick and binding agent. These walls absorbed heat during scorching days and released it slowly through cool nights, creating temperature moderation that made survival possible without modern climate control. For poor families, constructing a house meant months of physical labor. There was no choice to hire professional builders. Parents, children, extended relatives and neighbors worked together because a family could not survive without shelter, and shelter required collective effort. The wealthy employed skilled masons who worked with cut limestone, creating structures that lasted generations with minimal maintenance. But for the majority, for families like Jesus's own, building meant making thousands of bricks by hand, one day's production yielding perhaps 50 to 80 bricks, depending on clay quality and weather conditions. A modest single-room dwelling required approximately 2,000 bricks for walls 8 feet high. The mathematics was unforgiving. Survival required sustained physical exertion over extended time. Women hauled water from the village well. Men excavated clay from nearby deposits. Children gathered straw from threshing floors after harvest. The community shared knowledge of proper clay-to-straw ratios, of optimal drying times, of techniques for laying courses level without metal tools or measuring instruments beyond stretched string and practiced eyes. Jesus learned the relationship between material and form during these construction processes. He grew up understanding that weak materials, properly combined, created strong structures, that individual elements gained strength through proper bonding, that foundations determined everything built above them. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, through hands that mixed clay and straw, through muscles that lifted bricks into place, through eyes that judged plumb and level. The smell of wet clay, the grit of dried mud under fingernails, the ache of shoulders after laying courses became part of his physical memory. Later, when Jesus spoke about building houses on rock versus sand in Matthew 7:24-27, he was not creating metaphors from imagination. He was describing the lived reality of watching poorly founded walls collapse during winter rains, of seeing families lose months of labor because foundation work was rushed or neglected. This reveals something fundamental. The parables emerged from embodied knowledge, not theoretical speculation. When we enter the reality of how these houses function daily, the modern concept of designated rooms dissolves entirely. A typical Galilean family home consisted of a single primary space, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, where sleeping, cooking, eating, working, praying, and receiving guests all occurred within the same walls. This was not poverty's compromise, but the standard arrangement for ordinary families. The space organized itself not through permanent divisions, but through portable objects and daily rhythms. Sleeping mats rolled up each morning and stacked against walls. Cooking vessels moved to the courtyard during warm months and near the interior fire pit during winter. Grinding stones occupied their permanent position because their weight made frequent movement impractical. Looms leaned in corners when not in use. Storage jars lined walls, each containing specific provisions: grain, oil, dried fish, olives, lentils. The floor itself, usually packed earth mixed with limestone powder and animal blood to create a hard surface, showed wear patterns that revealed traffic flow and activity zones. For wealthy urban families, houses expanded to include separate rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with designated spaces for storage, cooking, and sleeping, often incorporating a second story accessed by external stairs. Servants managed household labor that poor families performed themselves. But for villagers, for craftsmen and farmers and day laborers, the single-room dwelling demanded constant negotiation of space and time. Privacy was not a physical reality, but a social agreement. Families developed protocols for averting eyes, for creating psychological space within shared physical space. Conversations happened in whispers when others slept nearby. Marital intimacy required careful timing and discretion. Children learned early to occupy minimal space, to move quietly, to respect invisible boundaries that shifted throughout the day. This spatial compression meant everyone witnessed everyone else's habits, struggles, prayers, and weaknesses. There were no secrets, no hidden corners, no escape from communal awareness. Jesus learned that genuine community meant shared vulnerability, not polite distance. He grew up understanding that loving your neighbor began with tolerating their proximity, their sounds, their smells, their presence in your intimate spaces. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, through nights sleeping shoulder to shoulder with siblings, through days working alongside family members in quarters that offered no retreat, through mealtimes where every shortage and every provision was visible to all. The sound of your father's breathing at night, the sight of your mother's tired hands preparing evening meals. The unavoidable awareness of when someone was ill or grieving or angry became the texture of formation. Later, when Jesus spoke about the kingdom of heaven being like yeast hidden in 3 measures of flour in Matthew 13:33, he was not creating distant agricultural metaphors. He was describing what he watched his mother do weekly in their shared living space, the mysterious transformation that occurred when invisible agent mixed with ordinary substance, the patience required for rising, the heat necessary for completion. This detail profoundly alters how we understand his teaching method. After understanding the physical constraints of these dwellings, we must recognize how profoundly they shaped the experience of time itself. Houses in Jesus' era had minimal artificial lighting, which meant daily rhythms followed solar patterns with rigid necessity. Small oil lamps, clay vessels no larger than a fist filled with olive oil and fitted with linen wicks, provided the only illumination after sunset. These lamps produced light equivalent to a single modern candle, casting a circle of warm yellow glow perhaps 6 feet in diameter, leaving corners and edges in shadow. The smell of burning olive oil, slightly acrid and vegetal, filled interior spaces each evening. A household might possess 2 or 3 lamps, but olive oil represented significant expense for poor families. This created a fundamental calculation. Every hour of activity after dark consumed resources that could otherwise feed the family. The practical consequence was that productive work ceased at sundown. Weaving, sewing, food preparation, repairs, all tasks requiring visual precision happened during daylight hours or not at all. Families rose before dawn, beginning work as soon as eastern skies showed first grey light. The wealthy could afford abundant oil, extending their productive hours and social gatherings into night. They hosted evening meals that lasted hours, conducted business after dark, read scrolls by lamplight. But ordinary families went to sleep shortly after sunset, not from lack of ambition, but from economic necessity. Winter meant longer nights, which meant more time in darkness, more oil consumed for basic visibility, more pressure on limited resources. Summer's extended daylight permitted longer work days, more productivity, less expenditure on illumination. Jesus learned that time was not an abstract measurement, but a tangible resource bound to physical realities. He grew up understanding that light determined possibility, that darkness imposed limitations not from divine prohibition, but from practical constraints. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, through countless evenings, when failing light forced work to stop mid-task, through winter mornings when the family rose in cold darkness to maximize precious daylight hours, through the discipline of completing essential tasks before the sun dropped below the western hills, the gradual dimming of interior spaces as sunset approached, the transition from clear vision to shadows to near blindness without artificial light, the communal gathering around the single lamp's small circle of illumination became rhythms that structured consciousness itself. Later, when Jesus declared in John 8:12 that he was the light of the world and that whoever follows him would never walk in darkness, he was not employing poetic abstraction. He was invoking the visceral memory of fumbling through dark rooms, of the relief when someone lit the evening lamp, of the fundamental human need for illumination to function. And it is precisely this that begins to reveal how physical deprivation prepared spiritual vocabulary. Beyond the daily routines and material constraints, the architecture of these houses contained a feature that profoundly shaped spiritual formation: the accessible flat roof. Unlike modern peaked roofs designed solely to shed water, first-century Palestinian houses featured flat roofs constructed from wooden beams laid across the walls, covered with branches, reeds, and compacted mud mixed with lime. These roofs served as additional living space, as workrooms for drying fruits and grains, as sleeping areas during hot summer months, and as gathering places for prayer and conversation. External stairs, often simple stone steps built against an exterior wall, provided access without requiring entry through the main living space below. This architectural detail meant the roof belonged simultaneously to the household and to the broader community, a semi-public zone where boundaries between private and communal blurred. The roofs required constant maintenance. Winter rains eroded the mud surface, creating leaks that dripped into living spaces below. Each spring, families hauled fresh mud to the roof, spreading and compacting it with stone rollers to restore waterproofing. Children played on these surfaces, women worked there during pleasant weather, men gathered there for evening discussions. The texture underfoot was hard-packed earth, slightly yielding, warmed by the sun. Standing on a roof, you could see into neighboring courtyards, observe street activity, call to friends passing below. This vertical dimension of village life created accountability and connection. Nothing remained entirely hidden. Someone on a roof could witness what happened in adjacent spaces. Privacy was compromised, community was inescapable. Jesus learned that walls create divisions, while roofs create meeting places. He grew up understanding that true hospitality sometimes required breaking through barriers, that access to healing and teaching might demand unconventional entry points, that the kingdom operates through openness rather than defensive enclosure. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, through afternoons helping repair roof surfaces, through summer nights sleeping under stars on these elevated platforms, through witnessing how roofs facilitated community connection that walls might obstruct. The physical effort of climbing external stairs, the panoramic view from roof height, the sense of being simultaneously sheltered and exposed, became metaphors waiting for theological activation. Later, when friends lowered a paralyzed man through a roof to reach Jesus in Mark 2:4, the gospel audience would not have found this shocking or destructive. They understood that roofs were penetrable by design, that mud surfaces could be opened and repaired, that desperate hospitality sometimes required literally making space. This reveals something fundamental about how God's kingdom disrupts our protective boundaries. How faith sometimes means dismantling what we built to feel secure. How healing requires communities willing to create access points others cannot reach alone.